But the next thing we're going to talk about is the Atlantic slave trade. Incredibly important topic. We could spend a lot more time than the book allots speaking of slavery. So we've learned that the Portuguese are coming down the coast. They're setting up trading establishments in Africa. The Spanish move across into North America and South America. The Portuguese in Brazil, and they take land. The Caribbean island become a major place where the Europeans not only take land, but they set up these huge farms called plantations, okay, in the Caribbean islands. And well, at first they enslave the Native Americans. That doesn't work. Native Americans oftentimes will just run away and blend in with the tribes in other parts of the area, and Europeans can't find them or capture them or bring them back to work. So eventually we see slaves from Africa being brought to work in these plantations as free labor in the farms. And there's an old story about how at first the Europeans, the Portuguese mostly, when they would come down and trade with Africa, they would trade European stuff, European furniture, and European guns for African gold. Okay, but eventually the Africans would run out of gold, but they still needed guns, because the way the Portuguese would do this is they would go to the village by village and sell one village guns, and then tell them, hey, you know, that village over there has guns. If you guys don't get guns, you're going to get taken over by them. And in this way, they almost pressured many of these African villages to buy guns from them. And then when they ran out of gold, they would say, look, you can just sell me people for these guns, for these European goods. And this is kind of the beginning of slavery from Africa, which really doesn't impact Europe as much. They don't have a lot of these huge farms in Europe. The farms, the plantations, are in the Americas. And really, they're mostly in the Caribbean, in Brazil, and of course in the southern colonies of the United States. But before we even get there, I want to talk about the slave ships and the horrors that the Africans were put through as they were forced to come to this continent and work as slaves. This is a drawing of how they would fit as many possible Africans underneath deck in the cargo area of the ship for this 2, 3, sometimes 4 week journey across the Atlantic Ocean. And you can see, yeah, you guys, these are people chained down next to each other in the most efficient possible way so that they could fit as many people as they could, and they wouldn't even let them get up to use the bathroom. So now what we're saying is that, yeah, you use the bathroom where you lie. They bring you food and they bring you supplies, but I was told by a college professor when I was in college, I was a history major, that you could smell these ships before you could see the ships coming along the coast. And it's an interesting thing. The curvature of the Earth, so if you look at the Earth, right, the curvature, it only allows us to see 7 miles on flat land. So if you're standing on a flat area and there's no mountains around, you can only see 7 miles before the curvature of the Earth makes it so you can't see any further. There's an old story, and I had a friend who traveled, and she used to tell me that this area between Spain and Africa is 10 miles. So if you're standing on the beach in Spain, you can't see Africa. And if you're standing on the beach in Africa, you can't see Spain. But if you take a ship or a boat, you can actually put yourself right in the middle of the two, and this is called the Straits of Gibraltar, where you can see Africa on one side and Spain on the other, because it's 5 miles apart in either direction. And because of the curvature of the Earth, you can only see 7 miles. Now, if you're standing on a mountain, that kind of takes away the flat land thing, and you can see further. But I digress. So this horrible journey that these people were forced to go through And then, of course, when they get off the ship, they're forced into labor, free labor. And in Africa, they had this image of slavery as being a temporary thing. So when they're selling their people into slavery, they're saying, you know, we're going to do this. And maybe it's a 7-year indentured servant situation, but it's not the kind of slavery that existed here in the Americas, where not only are you a slave, but your children are slaves, and your grandchildren are slaves, and there will be breeding of people to try and raise stronger slaves. I mean, what the horrors that African people um, had to live through when they came to this continent and had to work as slaves are unimaginable. Um, they would have families broken up. Now I just had kids, and oh, my kids are going to be sold off. It's just unbelievable suffering that these people went through. And when the Africans first sold them into slavery for the guns or European goods, they didn't realize the kind of slavery that they were selling there. Usually not people from their village, but prisoners of war that they had captured from other villages into. So looking at my slide before I get here, we're going to say at first they enslaved Native Americans. It didn't work especially well. Disease ravaged the Native Americans, and also if they just went away. The European merchant ships would bring stuff from Europe, manufactured goods, furniture, guns, to Africa, where they would trade for slaves, which they would bring to America, and they would trade the slaves for raw materials. So this is where they would trade for stuff from the farm: sugar, tobacco, cotton, which they would bring back to Europe and would use to make stuff. Foods with your sugars, cigarettes, cigars, and clothes were a big seller, textiles, cotton, clothes, from the cotton that was being made in the Americas back in Europe. Right, so we kind of see that here. 10 million enslaved Africans were brought to the Americas. And it wasn't until the late 1700s that the Europeans started to say, this is horrible. We can't do this anymore. It's inhumane. But then, of course, and I think France outlawed slavery in the 1790s, England in 1800, it takes the United States until 1865, 65 years later, until we end slavery here after we had to fight the bloodiest war in American history to end slavery. The southern states were making a ton of cash on slaves, and they didn't want to give up that money. And then Brazil, I believe it was 1889 or something, they were the last American country to give up slavery. And I really find this map interesting. I'm going to scooch this. Look, you can see where the slaves came from and where they went. So, you know, what is this? 750,000 slaves came from Senegal, 400,000 from Sierra Leone, 300,000 from Westward Coast, 1.2 million from the Gold Coast, 1.9 million from Benin, 1.5 million from, I don't know, this area here. But the hugest chunk, 5.4 million, came from West Central Africa, the area of the Congo. And as they were brought across, you can see that the majority of slaves went to Brazil or the Caribbean islands. And it was actually a smaller number of slaves that end up going to the United States. And you know, truth be told, the Americans are kind of known as being people who didn't treat their slaves as bad, which is kind of a odd thing to say. I mean, anytime someone's a slave, they're being treated horribly. And that's why in Brazil, in the Caribbean islands, a lot of slaves died. They were worked to death. Where in America, slaves were not killed as much, but of course they were just kept as slaves for 100, 150 years before 200 years sometimes, before slavery ended after the Civil War. And a lot of people will say that this is the original sin, that America was built on the original sin of slavery. And then others will argue, no, the original sin was the genocide of the Native Americans and the stealing of this land, and that slavery was the secondary sin, I don't know what the right phrases, both obviously not good things that our country has done in its past.